All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. My name is Brandon Morgan. I'm here with Jessica today. We're not usually double in a frame, but that's
we
afternoon.
have 4 kids in the back room,
so it's a good time.
Trying to keep them quiet, but yeah.
But again, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your support of the Latin American Studies Speakers Series. And we are looking forward to hearing more from Pablo. I wanted to just mention a couple of things about the Mellon Foundation funded initiative, New Mexico Humanities Now. We've kind of worked in tandem with that initiative at CNM and UNM, as well as with the partnership that we've had for a long time with the Latin American Studies Department and with the LAII. New Mexico Humanities Now provides a lot of different opportunities for students, particularly at CNM and at UNM branch campuses, to learn a bit more about humanities pathways for transfer, specifically with the goal of transferring 2 programs in the humanities at UNM. We also have events. We're going to be doing a few things in the fall, specifically around kind of like open houses for philosophy, for religion, for American studies, and some of those humanities programs. And so please look for those events to be coming. I just want to mention, I haven't mentioned this to Lenny or anyone at the LAII yet because it's brand new, but there will be another Latin American Studies speaker within the next couple of weeks. It'll be geared specifically toward the Guatemala Study Abroad program, but we'll invite everyone. So be on the lookout for that as well. I'll turn the time over to Jessica now.
Okay. Thanks, Brandon. And so specifically for CNM, as I see a bunch of familiar names from some of our anthropology classes from this summer. So thank you all so much for being here. That's awesome. And just for you all, or for any prospective or current CNM students, Latin American Studies at CNM, we have an associate's degree. We offer a range of really interesting classes. Namely, we have our intro class, but we also have a film class that's really fun. And then, you know, other supporting classes that are related to Latin America. So know that it's a degree that you can get at CNM, and it's a robust program. And part of it, and it's something that Brandon and I have been working on and we're doing this summer, is a study abroad program. And it's a study abroad trip meant to be more accessible and affordable because it's a trip instead of a whole semester. It's a wonderful experience. We're going in August with 10 students to Guatemala and mostly in Antigua, but we'll do some traveling as well. And then next year we plan to do Mexico City. So it's just a really exciting opportunity at CNM, and it's pretty unique for community college, but it's a pretty unique experience. So can I cover? Okay. Okay. Without further ado, we'll hand this over to Pablo. I'd just like to briefly introduce him. Thank you so much, Pablo, for being here. We're so happy to have you. So Pablo recently finished his master's degree in Latin American Studies at UNM. Congratulations. And is now a PhD student in geography at the University of Georgia. He's interested in ethnography, history, landscapes, and social theory. Pablo uses a framework of political ecology and critical and decolonial scholarship to interpret and analyze environmental change, environmental governance, and human-environment relationships. Wonderful, and we will hand it over to you. And let me just, I promise I will hand it over. If you have questions, we hope you do. We ask that you hold them to the end. You can type them in the chat as you think of them, and I'll read them for you, or if you'd rather ask yourself, we'll certainly open it up at the end, but we'll save those for the end of the talk. Thank you again all for being here.
Thank you, you two, for the introduction. And I do have a couple slides if I'm able to share them, just so everybody gets an idea of where I'm talking about. But yeah, like they said, I just recently graduated. I wanted to say I did start my academic career also at a community college. And my first degree was an associate's degree in anthropology. And it served me very well. I was so pleased with that experience. And actually, it did a lot for my undergrad experience because I was able to take so many of the classes, kind of the general ed classes, out of the way. And then during my 2 years at the university, I was able to really focus on my undergrad on the upper division anthropology courses and things like that. So I think that it's great that you all have this start to your careers. And so today specifically, I wanted to talk about my fieldwork experience in Costa Rica. I was there in 2022 during the summer. And since some of you are anthropology students, I'm guessing that you're familiar with the idea of ethnography. But I did want to introduce the topic briefly and just say that ethnography generally means to write about people. In the past, in kind of traditional anthropology, we tended to take more of an outside perspective towards the places we study. And in anthropology, we call that an edict perspective. But now we've been shifting that a lot. And so more and more people are trying to study places that they have some kind of familiarity with or that they have a connection to. In the past, this was considered to be somehow less objective, but I think that that's not correct. And I think that that idea is changing a lot. And so I think that I'd like to encourage everybody, if you find a lot of value in the place that you come from, in the culture, the traditions you have, and you want to share that, I think that that's a really commendable goal. And it's more and more acceptable in the field of anthropology, which, as we know, does have some colonial roots. But more and more, we're trying to kind of move beyond these colonial perspectives that our field began with, and try to move into more of a decolonial or a post-colonial set of perspectives that we use. And so that was a big part of my motivation in terms of choosing Costa Rica, and specifically what we call a canton, which is kind of like a county where my dad comes from. And so this is a very special place. It was only settled by kind of national Costa Ricans during the 50s. So that's kind of the place where my story, or the story that I'm telling, begins, is in the 50s in this place called Koto Brus in the southwest of Costa Rica. It's important to note that the history of that place actually goes back much further than our national history kind of says, right? Because our national history in a lot of ways is based on an idea of a kind of Spanish nation state that we call Costa Rica. And in its current form, it has only existed since 1948, which is the Second Republic of Costa Rica. Before that, there was, of course, a lot of people living in this area: indigenous people, Panamanian people, and people from throughout Central America. My study did not really cover that period, but I think it's really important to say that simply because the history of Costa Rica, or what we call the historiography of Costa Rica, doesn't extend back beyond 1948 in this specific place, that doesn't mean that there wasn't history or important things happening there, right? There was very many important things happening, but the particular gaze we use as historians or geographers or anthropologists tends to focus on, well, I don't want to say it tends to focus on more modern formulations, but it has a specific kind of a gaze that chooses subjects. So I just wanted to make clear that just because my studies do not go back beyond that doesn't mean that it's not important. It's actually really critical. And in the future, I hope to extend my studies back into more of the indigenous history of this place. That said, I wanted to share a couple slides with you. Like I said, the region that I study is called Coto Brus, and this is the seal of our canton. It depicts an indigenous person. I'm not quite sure what they're doing. It looks like they're maybe placing posts for a structure. And then there's a map on the other side of this slide that shows you where Costa Rica is, and the highlighted section in the kind of bottom right corner, or the southeast corner, is the canton that I'm studying, Coto Brus. Costa Rica's in Central America, so on the globe, this is below Mexico and above Colombia, and the bordering countries of Costa Rica are Nicaragua and Panama. So this is a more detailed view. The highlighted area in blue shows you my study region, and then the other map shows you is centered on exactly the town that is in the middle of the canton I study, San Vito. And so you can see that it borders on Panama, and it's in a fairly distant region of the country. The capital of the country is in San Jose. It's right in the middle, and it's in what we refer to as the Central Valley. So that's part of why this area was not settled until fairly recently. Part of that has to do with the expansion of what an anthropologist, James Scott, calls space-destroying technologies. And so these are technologies like all-weather roads, like manual transmission vehicles, radios, airplanes, things like this that allow us to bridge space in a way that actually was not very easy before 1948. And if you look at historical accounts about Costa Rica, most of Costa Rica outside the Central Valley was considered as kind of ungovernable. And so the indigenous people in those areas were considered unconquerable and ungovernable by the Spanish, which is part of why it took such a long time for us to then establish colonies in that area. So just for a brief timeline of this region and the country as a whole, in 1948, we had our national revolution, and it began what we call the land to tiller legislation movement. And this was a movement that allowed people to take land, clear it, and put it to use, and get title to that land without any kind of a purchase. And so it was a way to redistribute land in Costa Rica to people who would put it to agricultural use. It's a little more complex than it sounds, because it's not as if this land was completely uncontested, right? There's a lot of people who claimed rights to this land. And so again, I just want to emphasize the fact that there was indigenous people here with land rights, and that this land to tiller legislation conflicted with those land rights in a way that actually hasn't been resolved yet, and hasn't really even been discussed too much as far as I know. And then, so that lasted for about 30 years, that people were seizing land, clearing the forest, and putting it to agricultural use. This created a middle class in Costa Rica. It was a very beneficial thing in a lot of ways, but it also started to cause a lot of deforestation. So in the 70s, there was a big shift, not only in Costa Rica, but in the global consciousness about what it means to use environments. And whether or not environments have what we call a carrying capacity or a use capacity. And so during the 70s, a lot of global thinkers started to say, well, look, nature is not infinite, and environments don't have infinite resources. And so we have to find a way to manage environments that takes this into account. Costa Rica was actually one of the first countries to really kind of take this idea and use it in their laws and in their public policy to start reversing the trend of deforestation that was caused by the land to tiller legislation. So around 1996, they established a law that's called Forest Law 7575, which made it illegal to change land from forest to any other form of use. So you can no longer change forest in Costa Rica, for example, to pasturage, or to a field of crops, or to a coffee plantation. That's now illegal. It also established a program that we call Payments for Ecological Services, which is now a global model. It was first established in Costa Rica in collaboration with the World Bank and USAID. So this is an image of the forests in Costa Rica. You can see they're very dense, they're very diverse, and they still exist. You know, there's still about 50% land coverage in forests in Costa Rica. A lot of the influential shifts of what happened with these forests had to do with local and global forces. So that's something I like to point out in my research, that a lot of people think that it was simply that Costa Rican people needed land, wanted land, and decided to use it in this way. But a lot of what my research revealed is actually that there was global factors like commodity markets, like the coffee market, that kind of dictated how people use their land, right? Because traditionally, peasant farmers in Central America and Costa Rica grew a great variety of crops. They grew corn, beans, squash, a lot of fruits, a lot of different things that allowed them to both sustain themselves and produce a little bit for the market. But what ended up happening is that markets, Costa Rica had to eliminate a lot of its market protections for food that we eat in the country, like corn. And so markets eventually pushed out this form of subsistence production, and farmers had to rely more and more on commodity production. This is an image that I really love. It's a tree called a Saba tree. And this tree is considered the symbol of community in southwestern Costa Rica. And that goes back all the way to the indigenous peoples in the region who would use these trees as central gathering place. And people still use them in that way. For example, one of the folks I talked to there told me that there was a big fire in their village when they had first kind of tried to found it. And where everybody went to gather and see who survived, who was able to leave their home and everything, was to the Saba tree. As you see, they're huge. They tower over a lot of the other trees in the forest. And so I think that's a very striking image. And it shows you how close of a connection people feel to the forest and to the plants, animals, etc. So Costa Rica, since we've shifted from that kind of commodity production, well, we shifted first into this commodity production. Then in the 90s, we started to shift towards conservation. This is an image of a conservation site, which also does agrotourism. That's a small cabin. And it's settled in the middle of a very diverse forest. There's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of plant species just on maybe 2 acres of land, which is a very small area. But it shows you how quickly these forests can reestablish themselves. People say that in about 30 years, a forest in Costa Rica can reestablish itself into a fairly mature, interesting, what we call secondary forest. So these are some more images. That's a lagoon in the area that's very famous. It's called Laguna Fonso. And it has actually history going back more than 10,000 years with people who used to cultivate a crop called yucca, which some of you may be familiar with. I don't know how much we eat it in New Mexico, but it is very widely consumed in Central America and the Caribbean, for example. And it was one of the staple crop of Amazonian Indians or Amazonian indigenous people who used it for everything from food to making their textiles, tools, nets, very many things. On the other side, you see some cattle pasturage. And I wanted to include that because sometimes we believe that, for example, you cannot combine cattle production or coffee production with forests. But we see that, in fact, a lot of pasturage in the region is kind of what I'd like to call a mosaic land use, which means that there's forest or at least tree coverage interspersed with the commodity production, which in this case is for cattle. So that just gives you a kind of basic idea of Costa Rica and what it was that I was looking at there and seeing there. And I think that's important because maybe it's not easy to read and write about things, but it's very different to go and see something rather than simply reading about it. For example, in the case of this pasturage, if you see a statistic that says that cattle pasturage covers, this isn't a real statistic, but let's say 40% of the land in Koto Brus, you would think that it was just cleared, right? You would think that it was simply grass. But when you get on the ground and you look to see what it in fact is, you see that it's not quite so simple. And so that's a little bit about that. I'm not sure, did I stop sharing my screen properly? Yeah, okay, good. So after that introduction, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the experience of actually going and trying to talk to people. Because it's one thing to say like, oh, I'm gonna go and people are gonna tell me exactly what I wanna hear, right? Or they're gonna wanna talk about exactly what I wanna talk about. And I found that that's not always the case. And people have a lot of different perspectives. And I think that that's actually the beauty of ethnographic fieldwork, or really any kind of fieldwork where you go and you talk to people on the ground, because you see that maybe what you thought was the critical issue, or what you thought was people's point of view, may not be true. And so, for example, Costa Rica has a kind of mythology or a fame of being a very eco-friendly country. And people often think that all Costa Ricans are environmentalists or something like that. And actually, when I went and talked to people there, I found that the environmentalists that are, for example, at that conservation site that I showed you with the cabin, those people have a very small plot of land in Coto Brus. They have about maybe a hectare, 2 hectares. So they're not making a huge change in the land use pattern in the region. However, their neighbors are very critical of them. And it's something that I didn't expect. I thought that people would say like, oh, hey, you're doing exactly what Costa Ricans are supposed to, right? You're kind of upholding our national identity, our national traditions. In fact, people think that they're quote unquote crazy because they're doing something that takes this land out of production permanently. Because as I mentioned, Forest Law 7575 now says that you cannot change forests to any other use. So by planting or simply allowing the forest to regenerate in this area, they're actually taking this land out of production permanently. And I think that this is why their neighbors are critical. I actually wasn't able to speak to their neighbors in a future study. I really would like to see how exactly that perspective is. On the other hand, I think that there's a lot of people in the region who are very excited about reforesting. But I think that this is one of the key strengths of ethnographic fieldwork is that you get under what I like to call the mythology of identity, of space, of land use. And you get to what people in fact think, what people in fact do with their land in a way that isn't always apparent from statistics, right? Because for example, in Koto Brus, I think there's only a handful of conservation sites, which maybe wouldn't even show up in a statistical study because the sample size is simply too small. And so, so that's one aspect. I think the other aspect that I really wanted to talk about today is the kind of familiarity or the aspect of study in some place where you have some kind of personal connection. In my case, my grandfather was one of the people who founded this village or this canton. And he founded a specific village inside the canton called Saba Tree. And so when I went there, people, noticed that maybe I speak Spanish with a different accent than them. And I just seem like I'm not from the area. And so they would say, oh, hey, where are you from? What's your name? This and this. And then I would tell them my name and they would say, well, I know your cousin and I know your grandmother and I know, and so I think that this gives you a very different perspective. But you have to be careful because it doesn't mean that people are now going to tell you more of the truth. It simply means that they're going to tell you different things, right? And so in my case, after I went and did this field work, I tried to analyze why people told me the specific things they did. And I think part of that ended up being that they wanted to make me feel good about the place I came from, right? And they also wanted to show that the people who founded this canton, even though they engaged in deforestation, even though they did some things that had negative, we could say, environmental impacts, they were doing so because they had to get a livelihood, right? They had to support themselves, their families, and they simply had to eat. And so I think that in some sense, that's the other side of this coin, right? Is that maybe I had an increased access and maybe people were more willing to speak to me. But on the other hand, I had to be careful about taking things, not to say I don't believe my interlocutors or the people I speak to, but I do have to be critical in the sense that they have motivations, just like everybody else, right? Anytime you tell a story or you speak to somebody or you represent yourself, you have certain motivations. And I think that because we're doing this shift from a more outside to a more inside perspective in ethnography, in anthropology, and human sciences more broadly, I think we have to keep this in mind, that it's not necessarily better or truer, it's simply different. And so we still have to be critical of the kinds of information we're gathering, and we have to make sure that although we like to believe that everything we hear is true, that people don't want to deceive us, oftentimes people do not have a motive to deceive, but they do have a motive to present specific facts and maybe omit others. And they also have a motive to present things in a particular style. And so I think that these are all things that we have to keep in mind when we're doing field work, especially in a place where we may have some kind of personal connection. And so those are, I think, are the main points I wanted to talk about. And then I wanted to open this up to see if any of you all had questions about either ethnography in general, Costa Rica in specific, or this idea of doing a more inside perspective ethnography.
Thank you, Pablo. I have a mountain of questions, but I wanted but certainly if you have questions, you're welcome to just ask or do the hand wavy icon, or if you'd rather type it in the chat box, I'm happy to read your question for you. So whatever you'd like is totally fine. But Lenny has a question, so we can hand it over to her. Are you clapping? You're not raising your hand, you're clapping. What that is.
Clapping. I was clapping, but I do have a question, Pablo. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I had a curiosity at not knowing much about the history of this land. What happened to the indigenous population when these people were moving in? Was there like an official policy by the state of moving them, or was there integration? I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Like I said, I think there's a mythology in Costa Rica about both like these ungovernable indigenous people, but also a mythology very similar to the United States, where we consider these spaces empty. It's not true, of course, but that's kind of the story we're told. And so it's kind of difficult for me, at least at this point, to pierce that and see what really happened. But I did see some accounts of oral history that were actually collected by a Costa Rican historian called Rafael Mendez Trejos, who I was able to meet, and he gave me a copy of his book. And one of the families who founded one of the settlements in Koto Brus actually was an indigenous family who had fled from another part of Costa Rica, where they had been pushed out by I guess you would call them Hispano-American or kind of what we say is Latino settlers, right? And so from what I understand, indigenous people throughout the 19th century and then the 20th century were kind of being pushed around Costa Rica. And they would establish settlements. And then in the case of these people specifically, they established one settlement, and I'm not remembering the name of it right now, but they had large tracts of land. Some of them donated land, which is quite common in the area. Individuals would donate land, for example, for the church, for the school, to build a bridge, things like that, the plaza, a soccer field. Those are kind of the components that make up a community in this area of Costa Rica: the soccer field, the church, and the school. Those are the three kind of critical things. So the indigenous people had established these three components of the settlement. However, they began to have arguments both with each other and with the Latin or Costa Rican settlers, and eventually a lot of them moved and went to other places. And so that's one, that there's indigenous people in Costa Rica who do not live on what we would think of, I guess, in the US as a reservation, but live kind of interspersed throughout the population. On the other hand, we have 8 recognized tribes in Costa Rica, which are the Malacar, Bribri, Talamanca, and several others. And close to Koto Brus, there's the Bribri, for example, reservation, where they have land that they're entitled to in perpetuity. So nobody can buy or sell that land. However, as happens, I think, in other places in Latin America, there's a lot of violence and disputes around this land. And so, for example, Latin settlers will contest the indigenous people's rights to their land. And when they're not able to legally contest it, oftentimes they'll contest it through violence. And so it's a dangerous situation, and it's a situation that does cause violence. There's been murders around this issue of land. And so I think that Costa Rica has a lot of work to do in terms of formalizing, and not only formalizing, but enforcing the rights of these indigenous people to their land.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
I had a question. Most of my research brings me to Guatemala and Belize, and I spent a lot of time down there. I'm not familiar with Costa Rica, sadly, like in person, but I've heard lots about it and heard about this amazing policy that's been in place for, for decades to protect, the forest in particular, and the people and the animals of the forest. But so this is the question, like I really wanted the answer, but I don't know if it's a really broad question or a really obvious question. So, but especially when I went from Guatemala to Belize, northern Belize, where I work, the lack of pristine jungle is striking. Like so much of it is cattle pasture and sugarcane, and especially compared to Guatemala, which also has its issues and logging, but it's devastating what's happened in Belize. And so I guess that's like, from your perspective, like what is it about Costa Rica in terms of the history or the politics that really sets them apart? Because Guatemala, while the jungle, they have done a better job. There's still plenty of corruption in logging, and the mahogany is almost gone. So what about Costa Rica makes it, do you think, so extraordinary that they've been able to do this, even though not everyone is behind it, right? But they've still pulled it off, right? They've done an amazing job. So that's my long question.
Yeah, I think that's one of the central questions of my research is what makes it unique, what makes Costa Rica unique in this sense? And I think that there's two main factors. I think one is the geography, that it's simply very difficult to get around in Costa Rica. Almost the entire country is dominated by volcanic mountain ranges and very dense forests. And so this combination made it so that, for example, the Spanish tried over and over to expand outside, and they weren't able to. So I think that's one. And then I think the other thing is, as also you pointed out, the politics. That Costa Rica in 1948, we had a social democratic revolution. And we were able to do this because the US had not yet created its kind of Cold War policy of destroying, every social revolution that happened. And we had a figure who was called Jose Figueres, who had a very good relationship with the United States, although he was a socialist thinker. And he was the first president of our Second Republic. And there's a very good book about this called The Sparrow and the Hawk. But he was able to engage in this kind of diplomatic dance, for lack of a better term, with the United States and the UN to show that, for example, although Costa Rica is a social democratic nation, it's not aligned with the USSR. And so I think that a lot of Central American countries started to have policies like Costa Rica's during the 50s and 60s. But Costa Rica was able to get in just before and then establish this kind of detente with the US, where it was able to create its own policies. I don't know, it's kind of like one of these counterfactuals, as we say, whether or not, for example, Honduras or Guatemala, who had very strong socialist governments in the 50s, would have also pursued these kinds of environmental policies. But I think that one thing, I think that the immense trauma of the civil wars that happened in those countries made it almost impossible for people to focus on something like environmentalism when they were simply trying to survive, right? And another thing is, I think that so much of the cultural memory was destroyed through these wars. Whereas in Costa Rica, for example, one of the women I interviewed practices traditional medicine. And this is a practice that has been passed down by the women in her family for who knows how long, probably hundreds of years. And there wasn't that kind of disruption in Costa Rica that caused a total kind of breakdown of the society. And so I think that these two factors, the difficulty of the geographic access, that made it so that it was very difficult even to exploit the land in Costa Rica. If you wanted to, it was still very difficult. And then the political strength of our system.
Thank you. I really, that's a question I've had for years. Like, I
Yeah.
probably just read about it, but it was easier to ask you. So, thank you. So.
Well, I don't think anybody's written too much about this kind of exceptionalism. They've written in other ways, but not on these specific topics.
Kate, do you have a question?
Yeah. I know that when they had the revolution, that they kind of disbanded the military, and I was just wondering if that area was affected by it, or if it was remote enough to not be affected by it, and if it was, how was it affected by that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, our region is famous because a lot of the people who fought in the Civil War later settled in Koto Brus. It became kind of a center of colonization in the post-war period. And so some of the famous kind of inhabitants of this region are the officers who fought in the Civil War. And so that's one, that some of the soldiers came and settled in the region. And then another aspect of that is that many of the people who settled in that region were able to use, even, there's a funny story I read about through one of these oral history accounts, that, for example, one of the soldiers who had fought in the Civil War came down to Koto Bruce, and he gave somebody his rifle as the first payment on a piece of land. And so I think that a lot of the soldiers from the Civil War were able to come down to Koto Brus and use the gains that they had achieved in that war to fund their life there. And then the other aspect of that is that many of the vehicles, the military vehicles that were used in the Civil War were the only vehicles that were capable of accessing these areas. And so we had a colonization program called ITCO, and ITCO actually decommissioned military vehicles and then put them to use to bring colonists out to very difficult to access parcels. And so I think that the colonization was, if anything, a direct result of the end of the Civil War. And then, of course, abolishing the army opened up a lot of funding options. And so I think that something like ITCO wouldn't have been so successful if a lot of money was still going to our military. And so I think that abolishing the military was an incredible thing that we did. I think not only symbolically, but really materially and practically, in that it allowed the Costa Rican government to focus, for example, on education and healthcare, which I think without clinics, without pharmacies, this region wouldn't have been inhabitable by people who are not, who don't have a tradition of living in this region, like the settlers. They simply needed this kind of infrastructural support that came from the ex-military resources and officers.
Thanks, that was interesting, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Actually, another really interesting part of that question is that some of the people, I didn't mention this, but one of the really unique things about Koto Brus is it was also colonized by Italians. And there's still a big Italian community in the area. And the Italians say were soldiers, some people say they were not. And I think that a lot of them were, and then their identities were kind of covered, right? Because of course the Italians were kind of on the wrong side of history during World War II. And so if you had been a soldier, you probably wouldn't have wanted to make that very public. But that's another way that the kind of post-war environment influenced the settlement of that place.
Thanks for all that, Pablo. I also have a question. I was really fascinated when you were talking about the way you have to think critically about the stories that folks will tell you, particularly because this is a place that you're from or your family is from. And so I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about what kinds of critical frameworks or critical ideas you use to kind of analyze and think about the stories that folks are telling you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of my framework comes from political ecology. But also, I think throughout my career of kind of learning anthropology, learning about Latin American studies, I read a lot of decolonial literature from Africa and from Latin America. And I think that particularly the decolonial literature of Africa is very, very powerful in showing us that simply because you point out things that are wrong or that you believe are wrong with the place that you come from doesn't mean you're against it, right? And so I follow, for example, an author called Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who teaches now at UC Irvine. He's an amazing, not only scholar, critical theorist, but also a novelist. And he writes a lot about both taking what people say at face value, or maybe not at face value, but with a generous kind of a perspective, right? Saying like, hey, I think the things that you're telling me, you believe and you think are correct. But then I use, I guess, what I would call like a multi-scalar historical analysis that comes from like Phil McMichael, who says that, well, you can take what people are kind of like incorporated into, right? Their incorporated experience. And then by triangulating that with historical sources, statistical studies and other things, you can start to get a sense of how their narrative maybe doesn't contradict, but locks into or interacts with other kinds of narratives. And then finally, I have a book on my desk right now that I really love called The Will to Improve by Tanya Lee. And Tanya Lee has this perspective on development, which is different from other critical development scholars, where she says, look, I think that a lot of people who engage in development actually do believe that they're doing good work, right? And that if you take this perspective of like every development program is some kind of Western conspiracy to just like extract resources and take power and control, then you miss a lot of what's really happening in development. Because I think that a lot of people engaged in development have good motivations, but they don't have good information, right? And so she also suggests this kind of like open and generous mode of interpretation where you take people's, at least their motivations at face value, and then you can critique what the effects of their motivation are. And so I think that that's kind of like it. I have a complex framework for that, which comes from me being a very interdisciplinary scholar. But that, I'd say those are kind of the three components. It's like the post-colonial, drawn kind of from Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the incorporated comparison from Philip McMichael, and then the, I don't know what to call it, but Tanya Lee's kind of open and kind of generous interpretation of development studies.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
That was very sweet that your take on them talking out Koto Bruce for you, right? That they're going to say something different to you than because like, we want you to feel good about this place. We're just going to shine it up for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? No, we can wrap up. It's just fine. All right. Well, if we're all good, Pablo, thank you so much for taking the time. That was really interesting and really well presented. Thank you for that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming. I always love to share my research, and like a lot of scholars, I think sometimes I'm like, man, just 2 people are going to read my thesis or something. So it's always fun to kind of share it more broadly.
Yeah, no, great. And good luck as you move forward.
Thank
I'll
you
read
very
it. I can't wait. All right. Thanks all. Thank you all for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks again, Pablo.